Pankration was a sporting event introduced into the Greek Olympic Games in 648 BC and was an empty-hand submission sport with scarcely any rules. The athletes used techniques from boxing and wrestling but also other types, such as kicking and holds, locks and chokes on the ground. The only things not acceptable were biting and gouging out the opponent's eyes. The term comes from the Greek pi alpha gamma kappa rho alpha tau iota omicron nu, literally meaning all of might, from pi nu all, and kappa rho alpha tau omicron sigma strength, might, power. History. In Greek mythology, it was said that the heroes Heracles and Theseus invented pankration as a result of using both wrestling and boxing in their confrontations with opponents. Theseus was said to have utilized his extraordinary pankration skills to defeat the dreaded Minotaur in the labyrinth. Heracles was said to have subdued the Nemean lion using pankration, and was often depicted in ancient artwork doing that. In this context, pankration was also referred to as pamation or pamation, meaning total combat, from pi nu, pan, all, or total, and mu alpha iota, mashe, combat. The term pamation was older, and would later become used less than the term pankration. The mainstream academic view has been that pankration developed in the archaic Greek society of the 7th century BC, whereby, as the need for expression in violent sport increased, pankration filled a niche of total contest that neither boxing or wrestling could. However, some evidence suggests that pankration, in both its sporting form and its combative form, may have been practiced in Greece already from the 2nd millennium BC. Pankration, as practiced in historical antiquity, was an athletic event that combined techniques of both boxing and wrestling, as well as additional elements, such as the use of strikes with the legs, to create a broad fighting sport very similar to today's mixed martial arts competitions. There is evidence that, although knockouts were common, most pankration competitions were probably decided on the ground, where both striking and submission techniques would freely come into play. Pankrationists were highly skilled grapplers and were extremely effective in applying a variety of takedowns, chokes and joint locks. In extreme cases, a pankration competition could even result in the death of one of the opponents, which was considered a win. However, pankration was more than just an event in the athletic competitions of the ancient Greek world. It was also part of the arsenal of Greek soldiers, including the famous Spartan hoplites and Alexander the Great's Macedonian phalanx. It is said that the Spartans at their immortal stand at Thermopylae fought with their bare hands and teeth once the swords and spears broke. Polyhemus describes King Philip, the father of Alexander the Great, practicing with another pankratist while his soldiers watched. The feats of the ancient pankratists became legendary in the annals of Greek athletics. Stories abound of past champions who were considered invincible beings. Orician, Dioxippus, Polydamas of Skotosa and Theogenes are among the most highly recognized names. Their accomplishments defying the odds were some of the most inspiring of ancient Greek athletics, and they served as inspiration to the Hellenic world for centuries. As Pausanias, the ancient traveler and writer, indicates when he retells these stories in his narrative of his travels around Greece, Dioxippus was an Athenian who had won the Olympic Games in 336 BC, and was serving in Alexander the Great's army in its expedition into Asia. As an admired champion, he naturally became part of the circle of Alexander the Great. In that context, he accepted a challenge from one of Alexander's most skilled soldiers named Corrigus to fight in front of Alexander and the troops in armed combat. While Corrigus fought with weapons and full armor, Dioxippus showed up armed only with a club and defeated Corrigus without killing him, making use of his pankration skills. Later, however, Dioxippus was framed for theft, which led him to commit suicide. In an odd turn of events, a Pankration fighter named Eurytion of Phegalia won the Pankration competition at the Olympic Games despite being dead. His opponent had locked him in a chokehold and Eurytion, desperate to loosen it, broke his opponent's toe. The opponent nearly passed out from pain and submitted. As the referee raised Eurytion's hand, it was discovered that he had died from the chokehold. His body was crowned with the olive wreath and returned to Phegalia as a hero. By the imperial period, the Romans had adopted the Greek combat sport into the games. In 393 AD, the Pankration, along with gladiatorial combat in all pagan festivals, was abolished by edict of the Christian Byzantine Emperor Theodosius I. Pankration itself was an event in the Olympic Games for some 1,000 years. It is a matter of controversy whether and to what extent Pankration persisted in Greek and the broader Byzantine society after the ancient games were discontinued. Structure of ancient competition. There were neither weight divisions nor time limits in Pankration competitions. However, there were 2 or 3 age groups in the competitions of antiquity. In the Olympic Games specifically, there were only 2 such age groups, men and boys. The Pankration event for boys was established at the Olympic Games in 200 BC. In Pankration competitions, referees were armed with stout rods or switches to enforce the rules. In fact, there were only 2 rules regarding combat: no eye gouging or biting. Sparta was the only place eye gouging and biting was allowed. The contest itself usually continued uninterrupted until one of the combatants submitted, which was often signaled by the submitting contestant raising his index finger. The judges appear, however, to have had the right to stop a contest under certain conditions and award the victory to one of the 2 athletes. They could also declare the contest a tie. Pankration competitions were held in tournaments, most being outside of the Olympics. Each tournament began with a ritual which would decide how the tournament would take place. Grecophone satirist Lucian describes the process in detail. A sacred silver urn is brought, in which they have put bean-sized lots. On 2 lots an alpha is inscribed, on 2 a beta, and on another 2 a gamma, and so on. If there are more athletes, 2 lots always have the same letter. Each athlete comes forth, praised as Zeus, puts his hand into the urn and draws out a lot. Following him, the other athletes do the same. Whip bearers are standing next to the athletes, holding the hands and not allowing them to read the letter they have drawn. When everyone has drawn a lot, the alatarch, or one of the Hellanodiki, walks around and looks at the lot of the athletes as they stand in a circle. He then joins the athlete holding the alpha to the other who has drawn the alpha for wrestling or pankration, the one who has the beta to the other with the beta, and the other matching inscribed lots in the same manner. This process was apparently repeated every round until the finals. If there was an odd number of competitors, there would be a bye in every round until the last one. The same athlete could be in a Ephedros more than once, and this could of course be of great advantage to him, as the Ephedros would be spared the wear and tear of the rounds imposed on his opponent. To win a tournament without being an Ephedros in any of the rounds was thus an honorable distinction. There is evidence that the major games in Greek antiquity easily had 4 tournament rounds, that is, a field of 16 athletes. Xanthos mentions the largest number, 9 tournament rounds. If these tournament rounds were held in one competition, up to 512 contestants would participate in the tournament, which is difficult to believe for a single contest. Therefore, one can hypothesize that the 9 rounds included those in which the athlete participated during regional qualification competitions that were held before the major games. Such preliminary contests were held prior to the major games to determine who would participate in the main event. This makes sense, as the 15 to 20 athletes competing in the major games could not have been the only available contestants. There is clear evidence of this in Plato, who refers to competitors in the Panhellenic Games, with opponents numbering in the thousands. Moreover, in the 1st century A.D., the Greco-Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, who was himself probably a practitioner of pankration, makes a statement that could be an allusion to preliminary contests in which an athlete would participate and then collect his strength before coming forward fresh in the major competition. Techniques. The athletes engaged in a pankration competition, i.e., the pankratists employed a variety of techniques in order to strike their opponent as well as take him to the ground in order to use a submission technique. When the pankratists fought standing, the combat was called pankration, and when they took the fight to the ground, the stage of pankration competition was called pankration. Some of the techniques that would be applied in pankration and pankration, respectively, are known to us through depictions on ancient pottery and sculptures, as well as in descriptions in ancient literature. There were also strategies documented in ancient literature that were meant to be used to obtain an advantage over the competitor. For illustration purposes, below are examples of striking and grappling techniques, as well as strategies and tactics, that have been identified from the ancient sources. Fighting stance. The pankratist faces his opponent with a nearly frontal stance, only slightly turned sideways. This is an intermediate directional positioning between the wrestler's more frontal positioning and the boxer's more sideways stance, and is consistent with the need to preserve both the option of using striking and protecting the center line of the body and the option of applying grappling techniques. Thus, the left side of the body is slightly forward of the right side of the body, and the left hand is more forward than the right one. Both hands are held high so that the tips of the fingers are at the level of the hairline just below the top of the head. The hands are partially open, the fingers are relaxed, and the palms are facing naturally forward, down, and slightly towards each other. The front arm is nearly fully extended but not entirely so. The rear arm is more cambered than the front arm, but more extended than a modern-day boxer's rear arm. The back of the athlete is somewhat rounded, but not as much as a wrestler's would be. The body is only slightly leaning forward. The weight is virtually all on the back foot, with the front foot touching the ground with the ball of the foot. It is a stance in which the athlete is ready at the same time to give a kick with the front leg as well as defend against the opponent's low-level kicks by lifting the front knee and blocking. The back leg is bent for stability and power and is facing slightly to the side, to go with the slightly sideways body position. The head and torso are behind the protecting two upper limbs and front leg. Striking techniques. Punch and other hand strikes. Pankration uses boxing punches and other ancient boxing hand strikes. Strikes with the legs. Strikes delivered with the legs were an integral part of pankration and one of its most characteristic features. Kicking well was a great advantage to the pankratist. Epictetus is making a derogatory reference to a compliment one may give another. Mu epsilon gamma alpha lambda alpha capital iota zeta epsilon iota of sigma. Moreover, in an accolade to the fighting prowess of the pankratist Glycon from Pergamo, the athlete is described as wide-foot. The characterization comes actually before the reference to his unbeatable hands, implying at least his crucial role for strikes with the feet as with the hands in pankration. The proficiency in kicking could carry the pankratist to victory is indicated in a sarcastic passage of Galen, where he awards the winning prize in pankration to a donkey because of its excellence in kicking. Straight kick to the stomach. The straight kick with the bottom of the foot to the stomach was apparently a common technique, given the number of depictions of such kicks on vases. This type of kick is mentioned by Lucian. Counter. The athlete sidesteps to the outside of the oncoming kick but grasps the inside of the kicking leg from behind the knee with his front hand and pulls up, which tends to unbalance the opponent so that he falls backward as the athlete advances. The backhand can be used for striking the opponent while he is preoccupied maintaining his balance. This counter is shown on a Panathinaike amphora now in Leiden. In another counter, the athlete sidesteps the oncoming kick but now to the inside of the opponent's leg. He catches and lifts the heel foot of the planted leg with his rear hand and with the front arm goes under the knee of the kicking leg, hooks it with the nook of his elbow, and lifts while advancing to throw the opponent backward. The athlete executing the counter has to lean forward to avoid hand strikes by the opponent. Locking techniques. Arm locks. Arm locks can be performed in many different situations using many different techniques. Single shoulder lock. The athlete is behind the opponent and has him leaning down, with the right knee of the opponent on the ground. The athlete has the opponent's right arm straightened out and extended maximally backward at the shoulder joint, with the opponent's right arm across his own torso. The athlete uses his left hand to keep the pressure on the opponent's right arm by grabbing and pressing down on it just above the wrist. The right hand of the athlete is pressing down at the head of the opponent, thus not permitting him to rotate to his right to relieve the pressure on his shoulder, as the opponent could escape by lowering himself closer to the ground and rolling. The athlete steps with his left leg over the left leg of the opponent and wraps his foot around the ankle of the opponent, stepping on his instep, while pushing his body weight on the back of the opponent. Single arm bar. In this technique, the position of the bodies is very similar to the one described just above. The athlete executing the technique is standing over his opponent's back, while the latter is down on his right knee. The left leg of the athlete is straddling the left thigh of the opponent. The left knee of the opponent is not on the floor and is trapping the left foot of the opponent by stepping on it. The athlete uses his left hand to push down on the side back of the head of the opponent, while with his right hand he pulls the opponent's right arm back against his midsection. This creates an armbar on the right arm, with the pressure now being mostly on the elbow. The fallen opponent cannot relieve it, because his head is being shoved the opposite way by the left hand of the athlete executing the technique. Armbar shoulder lock combination. In this technique, the athlete is again behind his opponent, has the left arm of his opponent trapped, and is pulling back on his right arm. The trapped left arm is bent, with the fingers and palm trapped inside the armpit of the athlete. To trap the left arm, the athlete has pushed his own left arm underneath the left elbow of the opponent. The athlete's left hand ends up pressing down on the scapular region of his opponent's back. This position does not permit the opponent to pull out his hand from the athlete's armpit and puts pressure on the left shoulder. The right arm of the athlete is pulling back at the opponent's right wrist. In this way, the athlete keeps the right arm of his opponent straightened and tightly pulled against his right hip to lower abdomen area, which results in an armbar putting pressure on the right elbow. The athlete is in full contact on top of the opponent, with his right leg in front of the right leg of the opponent to block him from escaping by rolling forward. Choking techniques. Tracheal grip choke. In executing this choking technique, the athlete grabs the tracheal area between his thumb and his forefingers and squeezes. This type of choke can be applied with the athlete being in front or behind his opponent. Regarding the hand grip to be used with this choke, the web area between the thumb and the index finger is to be quite high up the neck, and the thumb is bent inward and downward, reaching behind the the Adam's apple of the opponent. It is unclear if such a grip would have been considered gouging and thus illegal in the Pan-Hellenic Games. Tracheal dig using the thumb. The athlete grabs the throat of the opponent with the four fingers on the outside of the throat and the tip of the thumb pressing in and down the hollow of the throat, putting pressure on the trachea. Choke from behind with the forearm. The rear naked choke is a chokehold in martial arts applied from an opponent's back. Depending on the context, the term may refer to one of two variations of the technique. Either arm can be used to apply the choke in both cases. The term rear naked choke likely originated from the technique in jujutsu and judo known as the hadakajime, or naked strangle. The word naked in this context suggests that, unlike other strangulation techniques found in jujutsu, judo, this hold does not require the use of a keikogi training uniform. The choke has two variations. In one version, the attacker's arm encircles the opponent's neck and then grabs his own biceps on the other arm. In the second version, the attacker clasps his hands together instead after encircling the opponent's neck. A counter to the choke from behind involves the twisting of one of the fingers of the choking arm. This counter is mentioned by Philostratus, in case the choke was set together with a grapevine body lock. Another counter was the one applied against that lock by causing enough pain to the ankle of the opponent. The latter could give up his choke. Throws and takedowns heaved from a reverse waist lock. From a reverse waist lock set from the front, and staying with hips close to the opponent, the athlete lifts and rotates his opponent using the strength of his hips and legs. Depending on the torque the athlete imparts, the opponent becomes more or less vertically inverted, facing the body of the athlete. If, however, the reverse waist lock is set from the back of the opponent, then the latter would face away from the athlete in the inverted position. To finish the attack, the athlete has the option of either dropping his opponent head first to the ground, or driving him into the ground while retaining the hold. To execute the latter option, the athlete bends one of his legs and goes down on the knee while the other leg remains only partially bent. This is presumably to allow for greater mobility in case the pile driver does not work. Another approach emphasizes less putting the opponent in an inverted vertical position and more the throw. It is shown in a sculpture in the metopy of the Hephaestion in Athens, where Theseus is depicted heaving Kirkion. Heave from a waist lock following a sprawl. The opponents are facing in opposite directions with the athlete at a higher level over the back of his opponent. The athlete can get in this position after making a shallow sprawl to counter a tackle attempt. From here the athlete sets a waist lock by encircling, from the back, the torso of the opponent with his arms and securing a handshake grip close to the abdomen of the opponent. He then heaves the opponent back and up, using the muscles of his legs and his back, so that the opponent's feet rise in the air and he ends up inverted perpendicular to the ground and facing away from the athlete. The throw finishes with a pile driver, or alternatively, with a simple release of the opponent so that he falls to the ground. Heave from a waist lock from behind. The athlete passes to the back of his opponent, secures a regular waist lock, lifts and throws, drops the opponent backwards and sideways. As a result of these moves, the opponent would tend to land on his side or face down. The athlete can follow the opponent to the ground and place himself on his back, where he could strike him or choke him from behind while holding him in the grapevine body lock, stretching him face down on the ground. This technique is described by the Roman poet Statius in his account of a match between the hero Tydeus of Thebes and an opponent in the Thebaid. Tydeus is described to have followed this takedown with a choke while applying the grapevine body lock on the prone opponent. strategy and tactics. Positioning in the scammer, as the Pankration competitions were held outside and in the afternoon. Appropriately positioning one's face vis-a-vis the low sun was a major tactical objective. The Pankration, as well as the boxer, did not want to have to face the sun, as this would partly blind him to the blows of the opponent and make accurate delivery of strikes to specific targets difficult. Theocritus, in his narration of the match between Polygex and Amicus, noted that the two opponents struggled a lot, vying to see who would get the sun's rays on his back. In the end, with skill and cunning, Polygex managed so that Amicus' face was struck with sunlight while his own was in the shade. While this positioning was of paramount importance in boxing, which involved only upright striking, it was also important in Pankration, especially in the beginning of the competition and as long as the athletes remained standing. Remaining standing versus going to the ground. The decision to remain standing or go to the ground obviously depended on the relative strengths of the athlete, and differed between Anno and Cato Pankration. However, there are indications that staying on one's feet was generally considered a positive thing, while touching the knee to the ground or being put to the ground was overall considered disadvantageous. In fact, in antiquity as today, falling to one's knee was a metaphor for coming to a disadvantage and putting oneself at risk of losing the fight, as argued persuasively by Michael B. Poliakov. Offensive versus reactive fighting. Regarding the choice of attacking into the attack of the opponent versus defending and retreating, there are indications, e.g., from boxing, that it was preferable to attack. Dio Chrysostom notes that retreat under fear tends to result in even greater injuries, while attacking before the opponent strikes is less injurious and could very well end in victory. Identifying and exploiting the weak side of the opponent, as indicated by Plato in his Laws. An important element of strategy was to understand if the opponent had a weak or untrained side and to force him to operate on that side and, generally, take advantage of the weakness. For example, if the athlete recognizes that the opponent is strictly right-handed, he could circle away from the right hand of the opponent and towards the left side of the opponent. Moreover, if the opponent is weak in his left side throws, the athlete could aim to position himself accordingly. Training in ambidexterity was instrumental in both applying this strategy and not falling victim to it.